A review platform conditions visibility on accumulated credibility signals tied to prior interactions. Access to trusted status is not immediate, but gated behind demonstrated reciprocity, creating an initial barrier that actors must navigate. Buyers recognize that leaving positive reviews increases their own eligibility for future trust recognition. Reviewers respond by selectively rewarding those who have contributed positively, reinforcing reciprocal alignment and shifting behavior toward mutual signaling. As these exchanges repeat, small clusters of buyers and reviewers begin to preferentially interact within the same group. Reciprocity becomes concentrated, forming closed loops where signals circulate internally rather than reflecting broader system input. At first glance, the rise in positive reviews appears to indicate improving product quality and reliable feedback. The visible signal suggests a system converging toward higher trust, reinforcing participation and increasing engagement. However, this explanation assumes that reviews are independent reflections of experience rather than coordinated exchanges. It fails to account for why the same actors repeatedly appear in each other's feedback cycles despite diverse product exposure. Inside these clusters, participants begin optimizing not for accuracy but for continued inclusion within the reciprocity loop. A negative review introduces the risk of exclusion, tightening the incentive to maintain positive signaling regardless of actual experience. The cost of breaking reciprocity becomes immediate and visible, while the benefit of truthful deviation remains delayed and uncertain. This asymmetry locks participants into reinforcing the loop, stabilizing behavior around mutual validation. As more actors observe that access depends on prior positive contribution, new entrants adapt by front-loading favorable reviews. Initial participation shifts from evaluation to signaling, accelerating entry into existing reciprocity structures. The system begins to aggregate these signals as if they were independent data points. In reality, clustered contributions inflate perceived consensus, masking the underlying coordination within each group. What appears as widespread agreement is, in fact, pooled output from tightly connected actors. The signal expands in volume while narrowing in informational diversity, distorting system-wide interpretation. Participants outside these loops face a different incentive landscape. Without prior reciprocal ties, their contributions carry less weight, reducing visibility and discouraging participation. This creates a segmentation between insiders with accumulated trust access and outsiders without entry points. Access to credibility becomes conditional, not on accuracy, but on prior inclusion within a reciprocity network. Attempts to contribute without engaging in reciprocity result in delayed recognition or complete invisibility. The system gradually penalizes non-participation in signaling loops through exclusion rather than explicit rejection. As clusters grow denser, internal reinforcement strengthens while cross-group interaction declines. Signals circulate within bounded networks, further amplifying internal consistency and reducing external validation. The platform continues to interpret aggregate positivity as system health. Yet the underlying mechanism has shifted from distributed evaluation to localized reinforcement loops. Even participants aware of this distortion face constrained choices. Exiting the loop reduces future eligibility, while remaining inside requires continued participation in the signaling pattern. The cost structure now prioritizes access preservation over informational accuracy. Behavior aligns with maintaining position within the network rather than reflecting independent outcomes. Over time, credibility itself becomes a function of past inclusion rather than current contribution. Trust is no longer generated by individual signals, but inherited through sustained participation in reciprocity structures. The system stabilizes around insider-controlled credibility flows. Access to trust remains gated within established loops, reinforcing a persistent equilibrium of segmented visibility and constrained entry. As reciprocity loops stabilize, timing begins to matter more than content. Participants learn that early contribution within a loop secures faster recognition, while delayed entry reduces visibility, shifting behavior towards synchronized signaling bursts. This creates a time compression effect where reviews cluster around interaction windows rather than actual usage outcomes. Signals become temporally aligned with reciprocity cycles, reducing the system's ability to reflect staggered or independent experiences. Because eligibility depends on accumulated prior exchanges, newer participants must invest disproportionately upfront. They contribute multiple positive signals before receiving any return, tightening the cost of entry and reinforcing dependence on established loops. Once inside, maintaining eligibility requires continuous participation in the same exchange pattern. Skipping cycles or reducing contribution frequency weakens position, increasing the pressure to remain active regardless of informational value. The platform continues aggregating these signals as independent confirmations of quality. In reality, each additional signal is conditioned on previous participation, creating a recursive dependency that amplifies apparent consensus. As loops scale, the same set of actors generates a growing share of total visible reviews. This concentration increases signal volume without increasing informational diversity, distorting system-wide interpretation. Outside observers interpret high-density positive feedback as strong market validation. However, they are responding to amplified loop output rather than distributed evaluation, reinforcing the visibility of already dominant clusters. This feedback draws more participants toward existing reciprocity groups instead of forming new independent ones. Entry pathways converge, concentrating activity and reducing the formation of alternative evaluation structures. At this stage, exclusion is no longer a discrete event, but a persistent condition. Actors without loop membership face ongoing invisibility, gradually withdrawing from participation and narrowing the active contributor base. The system's data pool becomes increasingly shaped by those already inside the loops. What appears as broad engagement is structurally filtered, tightening the alignment between signal production and loop membership. Even when individual participants attempt to introduce variation in their reviews, the surrounding loop dampens deviation. Outlier signals receive weaker reciprocal responses, discouraging divergence and reinforcing uniformity. This creates a self-reinforcing constraint where the cost of deviation rises with loop density. Behavior converges further towards standardized positive signaling, increasing rigidity within each cluster. Over time, loops begin to interact indirectly through shared visibility metrics. Clusters with higher internal activity dominate exposure, pushing smaller or less active loops toward marginalization. This imbalance accelerates consolidation around a few dominant reciprocity networks. System-level diversity declines as visibility concentrates, reinforcing the dominance of established clusters. There remains a narrow possibility that increased volume could still contain meaningful variation, yet the dependency between contribution and eligibility makes independent signaling increasingly unlikely, leaving the system's informational capacity structurally constrained. As these conditions persist, the platform's credibility signals become decoupled from underlying outcomes. Signals continue to circulate and grow, but their connection to actual evaluation weakens, deepening the system's reliance on internally generated reinforcement. The interaction loop no longer expands new information, but recycles existing signals at greater scale. This escalation locks the system into a stable pattern where credibility is continuously reproduced within the same bounded networks. Under this equilibrium, the system no longer rewards independent evaluation as a primary input. It rewards consistent participation in reciprocity loops, while ignoring signals that are not backed by prior exchange, narrowing behavior toward maintaining eligibility. Before, credibility could emerge from isolated contributions interpreted on their own. Now, credibility is conditional on accumulated inclusion, and signals without reciprocal history are systematically deprioritized, constraining entry paths. Negative or divergent contributions once functioned as part of informational balance. Within this structure, they trigger reduced reciprocity and loss of future access, effectively penalizing deviation and reinforcing uniform signaling. What the system amplifies is no longer the distribution of outcomes, but the density of reciprocal interactions. Signals aligned with loop participation gain visibility, while unaligned signals fade regardless of underlying accuracy, stabilizing behavior around contribution patterns. Over time, participation becomes less about evaluating and more about sustaining position within the network. The system settles into a state where credibility flows through established reciprocity channels, and behavior aligns with preserving access rather than generating independent signals.